we're here to celebrate, I suppose, and talk about this pretty terrific book. I'm in the happy position of having read it already. Peter, congratulations.
Thanks, Shaun.
On Big Blue Sky. It's magnificent. I'll just start by telling you a story which I'm not sure we've talked about before. We might have. Some years ago, I wrote a book about another Peter, Peter Costello.
That's right.
I know you're a big fan. I've read that in the book. You're an enormous fan. And I wrote it for Allen & Unwin, your publisher. And when the book had come out, the publisher took me to lunch and asked me to consider a new project, which was another biography of Peter Garrett, the lead singer of Midnight Oil. And it seemed to me that that would just be too difficult to do, because I knew that you were a very private person in terms of your personal life. You had a public life as a performer and as a person who was involved in a number of very, very important issues, but you didn't talk about yourself. And that was clearly a deliberate policy on your part. How hard was it for you to talk about yourself, to amass all of this information about your life and talk about personal things that you haven't talked about before?
It wasn't that hard, Shaun, and I wish we missed the opportunity for you to do that job, you know.
You've written it better.
I don't know about that, but look, it wasn't that hard, although I needed a bit of urging because I'm pretty private by nature. And I think that our modern culture is very selfie, self kind of focused, and I've always been interested in issues, and I'm not particularly self-analytical about things. But I also knew that, I'm an emotional person and I feel things as well, and if you're going to pick up your pen or sit down in front of the computer and do a memoir, I knew that part of that was actually trying to at least lift the lid on some of the emotional journey that goes with having a life and doing the stuff that you do. Hard at times, probably you'd sort of sit and sweat a little bit over it, but at other times, maybe even liberating.
Let's talk a little bit about your early life as you go through it here. You're really, like probably a number of people in this audience, a baby boom, classic kind of suburban, outer suburban baby boomer. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your upbringing and where you grew up and your makeup of your family, the values that you learnt in your early life?
Sure. I think that when I sat down to write, I realised that in order for me to make sense of the public life I had led, I needed to go back as far as I could in terms of memory. And in doing that, explain to people and tell a story of growing up as a kid in the northern suburbs of Sydney. I'm trying to think of an equivalent here, and I'm sort of reaching around a little bit. It's not Hawthorn, but I'm not quite sure. That's just because they've won the footy. But
it'd be like Doncaster or Bulleen or somewhere like that, I think.
And interestingly, at that stage, Sydney was a city which was growing quite rapidly, and my parents bought a block of land which was the last sort of street before the bush. And so I grew up with suburbs on one side, sort of over my right shoulder, and over my left shoulder, sort of a river valley and bush. And I grew up in a happy household, and we lived in that same suburb for a number of years, and we moved at one stage from the bush setting a bit closer into the railway station. But it was just a period of incredible freedom. And I think I'm very aware of the fact that just being left to your own devices as a kid from a very early age and playing in the bush with your friends. And when I'm the eldest of three boys, so when my younger brother started to grow up a bit, we used to get out and play. Had a very profound impact on me as a person. And I think it's very good for you as well. I think it's very good for the soul. It's very good for your self-confidence. You develop an appreciation of nature and the natural world. But of course, the irony for me was recognising that the place that I was exploring as if it were new, particularly when you're 7, 8, 9 or 10, you're sort of charging off, you've got imaginary games going on in your head, maybe you're pirates, maybe you're cowboys, maybe you're chasing villains or whatever. Of course, this was country that, Aboriginal people had been wandering around and traversing and visiting and living in for many, many years. And in the course of researching Big Blue Sky, I discovered that tribe, the Guringai tribe, who were still really visible people up until really quite recently. And it's a strong thematic in my book, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the relationships that we have with them. But the house was a happy house for the most part, and I think it was a middle-class upbringing. We weren't super well off, but my dad was a business manager, my mum was a social worker. And it was a house of conversation, and as you'd know now from reading it, a house of a fair amount of socialising.
Yes, incredible midweek socialising with people just coming into your home and having a drink and a talk, and music going all the time, of course.
Yes.
Music is an important thing, a very important theme here about popular music, but also classical music as well. I'm impressed by your appreciation of Catch a Falling Star by Perry Como. I don't know whether you want to share that with everyone here, but it is a lovely song.
It's a
great pop song of the 50s go. So in many ways, you can see now that the journey that you went on with the modern and the ancient, where you were on that sort of fault line there of the open bush and suburbia, and of course opening up your personality to other people, which you obviously watched your parents do, is really, it's fair to say that's something that you've pursued all the way through your life, is it not?
Yeah, and I think that most people take these early formative experiences with them, and I'm sure people who come to the centre and hear other authors, and particularly memoirists or autobiographists write about their work, you go back to childhood because, it'll help explain to yourself why you are, and it helps explain to the reader as well. And in part, Big Blue Sky is a lyrical ode to the Australian bush, to the beauty of Sydney, which is physically an extremely beautiful city, and a reflection on suburban life. And it was a rich life. We've had this idea in Australia that the suburbs are kind of these dull repositories of sort of conformity, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think it all happens in the suburbs as much as it does in the middle of the city. And I could see that from the way that my parents lived, people dropping into conversations. It was the period of time leading up to Vietnam, the end of the Vietnam War, a sort of a coming of age, if you like, of Australians who were ready to think about issues seriously. And all that stuff was happening in the home. And then the backdrop, of course, is what's getting played on the gramophone. It's an old-fashioned record player, as they say, and quite a wide choice of music. And I loved music as a kid. I sang in the choir, and I loved listening to what was going on in the home. And my parents said, "You're right, Catch a Falling Star it just hooked me." And my dad singing around the house as well, or even my mum occasionally humming. I don't think there's anything more comforting for a child, sort of going off to sleep at night and just sort of hearing, someone humming while they're doing the washing up, or just hearing a bit of music in the background as you finally sort of fade away. And that repository of immersion in play, in music, in conversation, and also being a well-loved kid, I think set me up pretty well for life, and I very much appreciated the upbringing that I had.
Your career in music, you studied law at ANU and then completed your degree at the University of New South Wales. But it's very interesting to see how you were looking for something other than your studies while you were at university. Plenty of people have been there, but you actually made a career out of it. When was the point at which you decided that being a musician or a performer, I'm interested to know if you regard yourself, what percentage of you as a musician, what percentage as a performer, if you could, that's not too reductive a sort of question to ask, but when was it that you thought, now this is really what I want to do with myself?
I think when I started performing at school and high school in school musicals, sang in the choir there as well, I enjoyed it, and I thought, I love doing this. And you develop a bit of a confidence that you might do it, and music was interesting to young people even then. And I know that, I went to an all-boys school, but some of the older boys were sort of starting to form bands, and people's hair was growing and the hippie era was sort of on us, and there was a lot of music about it, and particularly once I got to university, but even in the latter years of school. So I think I sort of had a distant sense that this was something that maybe I could do, but I wasn't entirely sure. The performing side came much later, and it came really as a result of seeing performers who were pretty shithouse, you know, and thinking, well, you know, they're getting paid a lot of money to do that. I think I might be able to do it a bit better.
Good gig. Yeah.
You know, it's the Dire Straits song, you know.
Yeah.
You know,
Money for nothing.
money for nothing. It's pretty much all there. Apart from the chicks for free.
Yeah. I was waiting for the second
My wife's
line.
here tonight, so.
Yeah. I didn't know where to go with that because Doris is in the audience.
That's
but
right.
but it seems to me that there's something in a performer, in a frontman, right? Frontmen are a different particular kind of subgenre of
This is right.
modern performers, are they
Yes,
not?
they are.
You know, because a band is a collective, Midnight Oil particularly a collective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But to get up out front, you really need something special, a belief in yourself, a confidence in yourself, don't you? Or is that not how you viewed it?
I'm not sure that that's right, Shaun, but I'm not sure that it's wrong either.
You know more about it than I do.
Well, this is so interesting, you know, because I don't think that consciously about performance. I never have, and I know it sounds a bit funny to people when you see a Midnight Oil film clip or you've been to a show and you sort of see us doing things which work visually, say for example. But really it's much more organic, much more impulsive, much more natural than that. And I think from my perspective, if there's anything in it, it's actually not being conscious of what you're doing. But performers quite often don't have that level of confidence. Say, for example, that I just happen to have to go out and make a fool of yourself and fall over and sing or do whatever. So they might have to boost themselves up by having a few drinks before they go on stage, or they might get the yips, or they might have the agonies or stage fright or whatever. And I look at performers with a great deal of interest, both here in Australia but also overseas, and I come to the view, when I think about it, that not everybody, but quite a lot of performers maintain a childlike persona. This is them sort of opening themselves up to the world on stage, but they're not necessarily very mature in the way in which they're doing it, but they know that it works. They've learnt that certain things work in performance, which come naturally to them. And then the difficulty is that they can become quite insecure about that. Because they think, oh, well, I'm almost like a child up here, but I'm in front of adults. And I think this is why people crash and burn so much, and why young bands don't last that long. And, you know, the left-right brain thing works quite, there's a real battle going on in my head all the time between this left-right brain thing. And I think, but the best part of that is the rational side of me can say, look, whatever it is, don't think about it too much. Yep. Just do it. And also, of course, if you've got a band behind you that sounds like the Oils, it's not that hard, you know. You just...
Yeah, you got pretty lucky with this.
Yeah, no question.
Band looking... This is how you joined the group, right?
Yeah.
You answered an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald.
Answered the ad.
Yeah. It was the band ready-made, ready to go. A lot of what you sang about in the sort of what some might regard as sort of preoccupation of the lyrical direction of Midnight Oil music was quite external, though, was it not? Most of the time, it was about either places or people or situations, not so much the kind of John Lennon style "Mother, you had me, but I never had you" and all those sort of things, right? Was that simply an expression of who you were? They were the lyrics. That was the sort of way you wanted to be an artist. Not delve deep and dig and all of those sort of things.
It was a reflection of the fact that we were a band. It wasn't Peter Garrett and Midnight Oil. It was Midnight Oil. In fact, Rob Hurst and Jim Magini, both great songwriters, had met at school, and they had the band, and then I came and joined them. And so a lot of our early period, I think, is us finding the common ground where, however the music was written, whether it was jamming or whether someone brought a song in or whether we took a song and put it together again later on, or whether I added lyrics or whether, Rob came with a full song or whatever it was, our thing was like, well, let's make it something which we all connect to, which makes sense to the character Midnight Oil, not the character Peter Garrett or, Martin Rotsey or whoever. And we were a genuine collective. What you say is absolutely right. We really believed in that. And by the way, I still do. And I think that because it was a group collective effort, and because we were people who were attuned to social issues and political issues, it wasn't a conscious thing. I've said this many times, but it's not like sitting down and having a manifesto. We are Midnight Oil. We will now write about, the environment, and it will be a song about, global warming, and it will, we'll make pollution will rhyme with, solution. That's not how you make music, and if you do, it usually sounds pretty bad. It's got to happen much more organically than that. Someone has to have an inspired idea, or you've got to come up with something when you're working together. And then you might mould it and shape it like a sculptor or a potter until you've got this thing called a Midnight Oil song. And then if it happens to connect at that political level, or it's got a social reference point, fine. But you look at an album like 10 to 1, there's a song on there called Screamin' Blue. It's a wild, crazy, psychedelic guitar opening, and then it's one of the few love songs. It's sort of a love song, if you like, from me, and no one ever talks about that song because it just doesn't fit the character of Midnight Oil. And there are many other songs like that in the repertoire. The final thing I'd say, though, I think, and I think why the question's so good is because, well, why isn't it that more bands don't do it, or why is it they can't carry it off? I think the answer to that is partly the character of my character, in as much as I was always interested in politics, and I wanted the band to be saying things that meant something to me, or saying things that I said or felt. And so as a consequence, that we had a level of awareness about. We weren't just sort of shooting the breeze. We really felt these things. And so you sort of really have to work hard at getting that to happen. And the other thing I'd say, which is really obvious and basic, but people used to make records on the run. They had budgets to make records, but they'd sort of get it to sound pretty good in the studio, and then they'd walk away from it. And I always said to the boys, we're not comparing ourselves with, X band who's playing in Melbourne tonight. We're actually comparing ourselves with Springsteen, or U2 or whoever. They're our peers. Let's sound as good as them. Let's sort of get to where these people... Which I'm not saying that Australian artists haven't written fantastic songs and can't get to that level, and obviously many have, and many did. Not so many then. But my reference was, well, let's look at the people who really turn us on musically, and let's work our way to where they're at.
And that's what enabled you, I suppose, to... I think you refer to Diesel and Dust, your very special album, as maybe the high point or the best thing that you did. That was the album that kind of broke for you in America, wasn't it?
That's right.
And so in a way, I suppose it smoothed the way for you because you were thinking, well, we can actually work at the same level as these guys, so why not make an album with an ambition that's as big as those guys?
That's right, and the band wasn't lacking ambition. And as I said when I was chatting to Francis Leach this afternoon, going into the desert into the Western Desert and spending time with Aboriginal communities and going out with an Aboriginal band, by the way, which was so important. For the writers, for the musicians in the band, it was this different texture, different rhythm that we felt and different sense of the way sound was there. And then, of course, there was a focus on what had happened, the history of places and where people were at. And then coming back and finding that we're a bunch of songs that sort of worked in that format, and then they came through so quickly and so easily. You're lucky when that happens because, boy, sometimes you can sweat forever and it just sounds worse and worse. So in this case, it went the other way.
So having had all of that success, both artistically and, in terms of sales, critics, all that sort of thing, you came to a point in the early part of this century where you segued into parliamentary politics. Where was the point at which you thought, look, that's got to be the next step for me? Were you getting tired of being a musical performer, making records and performing and doing all the other things that you do? Were you sick of the guys? What was going on there?
No, I wasn't sick of the guys. I think that we made a deliberate decision in the mid-90s when we'd broken as a pretty big band and we were starting to play to bigger audiences and we had airplay and MTV and all that sort of stuff was starting to happen for us. And the music industry is like any other industry. It's like the economic model, you either grow or you stagnate. There's no steady state economies.
Yes.
It's fascinating. So it was really a decision for us. Were we going to go to, not necessarily the next level, but the next stage, which would mean basing ourselves probably overseas, spending more time touring in North America, working with radio more, being more embedded with that global music industry. And at different times, we all had sort of different views about it, but I think at the end, I'm speaking for myself here, but I think the end of it, the consensus, and certainly this was my feeling, was that a big part of who we were was this place. It was Australia. It was where we'd played. It was the people we'd played to. It was the story that we understood the best because it was our country. And I think we would have lost something of what we were had we done that. We simply would have been doing it to become a more popular band. And we never started off wanting to be a popular band, so it didn't make any sense. And Australia's got a reasonable sized population, but it's not the kind of country that can support a band like Midnight Oil or an In Excess or a Cold Chisel easily, because once you've played your 5 or 6 shows in 5 or 6 cities, you're done, and what do you do for the rest of the year? So you do end up in a bit of a holding pattern. I think the other thing, Shaun, was that I had gotten very involved in conservation activism. I'd served 2 terms with the Australian Conservation Foundation, based here in Melbourne, and done a lot of campaigning around issues, rainforests, land care, issues to do with pollution and the like, and worked pretty hard, including going to Canberra and negotiating policies with people like former Prime Minister Hawke and Graham Richardson when he was the Environment Minister in the 80s. And so I knew that Canberra was a place where things happened, and if the opportunity came and someone came along and it presented itself, then I was likely to grab it. But if it hadn't come, who knows, I would have probably done something different. But I would have gotten more involved in activism, more involved in non-government organisations, more involved in trying to figure out, for the issues that meant something to me, how to work with other people to get them delivered.
But the fairy godmother who appeared in your life was Mark Latham. Waved his special brand of pixie dust on you and brought you into the Australian Labor Party.
Yes.
As the member for Kingsford Smith.
Yes.
If I can just be a critic for a moment, offering a genuine literary observation here, there's a quite distinct shift in tone in the book when you move into your life as a parliamentary politician. You're a politician before you entered Parliament for many years, of course. But there's a distinct shift in tone. There's a sort of joyous, occasionally languid feel to the book until you move into your time as a politician. I must say I enjoyed the shift in tone because you're so direct. You're very, very blunt, if I may say so.
It's not languid, no, that's right.
It sure ain't languid.
No.
And we know now, or some of us will know, that you became very quickly disillusioned with Kevin Rudd as leader of the Labor Party well before his fall in 2010, which I invite you to speak about in a moment. But you haven't really held back on a whole range of people and institutions here. I've got a little list here, and I'm just looking. So it begins with Kevin Rudd, and I think the question I've written out here, I'm giving the game away. I did come prepared. But you're also refreshingly blunt about the Greens, Greg Hunt, Martin Ferguson and Joel Fitzgibbon. These people are in subsets. And Jenny Macklin and Penny Wong with regard to different policies. We can run through them if you like, but Kevin Rudd you were very concerned about because, extremely concerned, and you refused to serve under him after his restoration in 2013. Would you like to tell us just a little bit about what you thought was wrong with the way that he conducted himself, and do you think that the Labor Party will recover? Why don't I put it in a positive way? Has the Labor Party recovered from Kevin Rudd's time as leader?
Well, I hope it can, and I think one of the subset stories, if you like, of this is that whilst the leadership challenges were ongoing, and while that became something which the gallery, of course, fed on ravenously and delivered stuff to people who became quite frustrated by it, I think. Senior ministers, that including myself, and certainly myself, because I didn't have any factional alignment, so I had no sort of sway over what would or wouldn't happen, really just wanted to get on with the responsibilities that we had and the jobs that we had. I mean, it's very interesting to go quickly from a very different setting into government. And even though I spent time in opposition, and I was shadowing the current Prime Minister at that time, as people might remember, Malcolm Turnbull had responsibility for climate change and environment under Prime Minister Howard. When you do arrive there, you've got I felt I had one or two choices. One choice was to continue to try and, in a sense, have a public advocacy role which might shape the party. We talk to the country, we talk to policies and issues, and get on with sort of doing some decision making. But the other was to actually be the best minister I could be and really concentrate on getting the department ticking over and getting as many things out the door as we could. And I chose that latter. Now, whether that's the right decision or not, it's actually an interesting question for me, particularly in the age of social media. And I was a celebrity candidate, so everybody wanted to knock me around a bit. And one way I responded to that was by coming into the parliament saying to Kim Beazley, who was the leader that succeeded Latham, I want to be on the back bench, I don't want to go onto the front bench, and I'm going to start again, and just try and work my way through. And if you think I'm doing okay, then maybe I'll get more responsibilities. Rudd's behaviour, though, and the reflections that I have on him, and the serious charges that I have, and my opinion about him, came as a consequence of writing. I mean, this is the really fascinating thing about writing, is that you're not quite sure where it's going to go when you start to write. And I knew I'd felt let down by Rudd as a leader, and I'd made up my mind about that at some point. But it wasn't actually till I started to write the story from my perspective, I hasten to add, not all my colleagues would share this by any means, but when I wrote it from my perspective, when I got to the end, I thought, wow, this is actually how I feel about this person. And I wasn't aware of people like Latham and Rudd's backgrounds that much before I went in. I had had very little to do with them. The caucus had chosen them as leaders, and I voted for Rudd, by the way, in the first...
against Beazley?
Sorry?
Yeah, against
Beazley. And I think Greg Combet said the same thing. I think it was a mistake. I think Beazley would have been a better leader. And you look at what Kim Beazley did when he lost the leadership. He sat on the back bench and mentored people like me and never undermined his party, never spoke out of turn, was a loyal servant of Labor. And you can't say the same for Rudd. So I didn't really, if you like, have a true appreciation of the character and the background, but I knew this person could possibly beat Mr. Howard, John Howard, and he did beat him. And then, of course, we have the period, which is all on the public record. Most of what I've said is on the public record. The periods of chaos and people waiting and punitive behaviour and the like. But for me, the real killer is his stalking of Julie Gillard, to paraphrase the very good book that Kerry-Anne Walsh wrote, where it's obvious to me in retrospect that he was much more interested in simply claiming whether it was revenge or what he felt was his rightful place because of the manner of his removal, that he was prepared effectively to undermine the government which he'd once led in order to get that position back. And for me, that was the final straw.
It's nothing to do with the fact that he demoted you and basically threw you to the wolves over the roof insulation problems. It's not you. I mean, he let you down there, didn't he? It's time-honoured political practice. The people are right behind you until the moment that they're not.
Yeah, of course. That's right.
Isn't it?
Yeah, look, I think
he proved it yet again.
That they didn't support me in the early stages of the difficulties of that process. When we could have had a united government front to deal with that, I was left hanging out to dry. But by the same token, I was the minister with responsibility for delivering the program. It wasn't designed in the department. It was designed in Prime Minister and Cabinet and Treasury and Finance. But we had the job. And I accepted that. I think that's a part of the discipline of cabinet solidarity and being a minister in a government. Well, not pretty behaviour on their part, but that was the way that it was. And then the way he managed that afterwards, of course, being demoted is you feel that. But it was as much the way in which those reactions happened, which I detail in the book, the way in which he behaved, the unpredictability, the sort of sudden switches and turns. And then eventually, of course, I think the caucus, like most people in the parliament, they come in, they want to make a difference, but also they want to stay there. And they felt that ultimately he might be a better prospect for lessening what would probably be a loss than Julia Gillard would be. But Julia Gillard never got a clear run, Shaun. You know, she never got a fair go. And I'm as honest as I can find in myself about my mistakes and also about the government's, including Julia's. But she was a very fine leader, and she was operating in very difficult circumstances in a minority parliament, and we got legislation was going through. We were doing big things, you know. National Disability Insurance Scheme, which I strongly support Jenny Macklin on that. The National Broadband Network, I mean, finally, you know, we were going to have sort of, you know, speeds as fast as Czechoslovakia. Yeah. Big education reforms.
Not quite as fast as Burundi, but we're getting there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, they were important things. They were nation-changing. And she negotiated and assisted in that. And I support and applaud Rudd and Wayne Swan for their response to the global financial crisis. I mean, we're so flippant about it now, and there were many commentators who felt that the whole thing was a total waste of money and a rush. But, I mean, they were amateur economists that didn't know what they were talking about. We had to do that. It was the advice of Treasury head Ken Henry, as you probably remember, and some others, you know, go in hard, go early, and go fast.
There's nothing wrong with overdoing it.
You've just got to throw money out there to build school halls, to get the insulation out. So my reflections on Rudd are more ultimately reflections about the nature of leadership and motivation.
Okay. What's the thing you're proudest of that you managed to achieve in politics? Is it Gonski? Is it what would it be? Your education, the education reforms that you helped to bring in, or are there other things?
Look, I'm a bit close to it, but I realise that I've got to talk to these things so that people know.
I'm encouraging you to be big-headed in front of this paying audience. Yeah.
Look, I think the Gonski education reforms probably are, because it was a really big reform. The work was started by Julia and her office, but it hadn't
Had to make it happen, right?
It had to happen. And it was a very big education reform. And it was something which many educationists have wanted to happen for more than 50 years. In fact, the Whitlam government talked about it, a needs-based funding system for schools, where you actually give the resources into these schools where the kids need them most. And you have a popular formula for it, and you spend the money on the things that make a difference. And it's massive. And the dollars, in terms of the budget allocation, were big. But this was in the context of Australia's education performance declining. And once the mineral resources boom starts to taper off, what is it that we're going to be doing as a country that's producing the kind of income that gives us the standard of living and, you know, has the roads and the hospitals and so forth? A lot of that's going to come from a well-educated populace. So it was a big reform. It was immensely hard work. I by no means take responsibility for it myself. There's a department of fantastic public servants that did it. We worked closely with the PM's office and others. But I must say that the day that it did pass the Senate, and as you know from reading Big Blue Sky, just in the nick of time, I'll count it as a proud moment.
It's a bit like being in a band, isn't it, I suppose? You're always having to share the credit for everything that goes
absolutely.
on. So you're used to that sort of thing, right?
Well, it's never one person.
Are you still a member of the Labor Party?
I am.
Are you active? Are you an active member of the Labor Party, or just
not at the
you've
moment,
retained your membership? Would you see yourself becoming more directly engaged in politics again, or do you believe that that part of your life is over?
I do see myself being directly involved in politics, Shaun, but not in party politics per se, and certainly not as a formal political career. I think it's just a part of me. It's who I am. I'm serious about issues, and politics is a place where issues get resolved, either internally or externally, working with community. And I think that my strong adhesion to the place that we all live in and the experiences that I've had as a musician and the wonderful privileges of getting around and knowing and seeing the country and caring about it means that I'll probably be in there somewhere, but this is not a political career thing at all. It wouldn't be as a formal politician.
Advocacy on issues and
whatever
different
comes
groups.
Yeah.
What did you learn about yourself? You alluded earlier to it. What did you learn about yourself by writing this book? What were the key, I had to use the term key learnings, but in fact I wish I'd never said that now, but what were the... Don Watson's coming in the room now to get me.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, my wife Doris is here with me tonight, and one of the things I learnt was that my family was the most important. I mean, I knew it, but I learnt through the writing of it how important the family had been to me. And the fact that she had been able to deal with the difficulties of having someone who was so out in the public light and was always charging off on this white horse, sort of going for the windmill. And then, of course, the next step being in the government, and very quickly, we did 2.5 years, and the next thing I know, I'm sitting behind the big desk, and I've got the Secretary of the Department saying, well, Minister, it's a little bit like, yes, Minister, but it's the real thing.
Yeah.
You're not going home that night, basically, is what it means. So she was wonderful in sticking through me through that period, and I learnt and uncovered that in writing this memoir. And I see this memoir as in part as a reflection and a song to the beauty of nature and growing up in Sydney and the Australian landscape, and part it's woven into that. Even underneath it is the great affection and love I have for my wife and family. And then I think the other part of it is, well, what do you do when you reach these different points in the road? How do you react? Why do you do those things? And isn't it crazy for all of us that there are these recurring patterns and synchronicities that sometimes come back and sort of give your life a little bit of meaning? And for me, of course, part of that is interaction with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I found at the period of time when the insulation crisis was at its height, and we had the terrible loss of those kids' lives, and there was a lot of public attention, and in the Parliament, Abbott was sort of after me and really trying to get me get the political scalp. I found that my Aboriginal colleagues and friends were as supportive as my other friends, people that I'd grown up with, and it was so interesting to me that they were very strong during that period of time.
It's very touching.
It was, maybe not surprising, but it was comforting. I've learnt that I'm a workaholic, and not somebody who gives much thought about what people think about them, actually. I've been popular, and I've stood on a stage and everybody's cheered, and I've stood on a stage and everybody's booed. So I've sort of experienced both those extremes. And I'm out and about a lot, and I'm still pretty visible, so I do talk to people a lot, and I love being with people. And the idea of being a local member and going to the shopping centres and going to the schools and doing that kind of work, which people sort of scratch their head about a bit, but I actually think it's pretty important. And I think that we run the country down way too much. Of course we've got to deal with problems and issues, and you can be frustrated at the way in which governments are doing certain things. And you see human frailty writ large in politics, but they're no different from anyone in this room. They're other people just with other callings. And we run the country down too much. And I used to see this at citizenship ceremonies. As a local member, it was my favourite thing. You go to a citizenship ceremony, and whether they're people who are refugees or seeking asylum, or whether they're people who've coming through on the business visas and then they've decided to stay, or someone's come on a tourist visa and they've married a great-looking Aussie boy or Aussie girl, and the incredible pride and excitement that they are actually going to be a part of this country with all its extraordinary and very rich inheritances and opportunities for people, where they won't be shot or locked up because of what they think, where their kids will go to a school and get basically still a pretty good education, it could be better, where they're free to religiously practice, where they can start up a business and they know that they don't have to bribe somebody, to get their goods delivered the next day. There's a massive range of things that we have in this country that make it an incredibly wonderful place. And I sort of learnt that, again, writing the book. I sort of, and as you probably know, when I finally get to the end of Big Blue Sky, I sort of create this scene where I'm reflecting on what that means to me as I'm departing from the scene and I'm waiting for other young people to come through.
In here, in the book, you had to tell the story of losing your mother in a house fire, and you were the other person there in the home. How tough was that for you to have to put that through words and relive that experience and share it with other people?
Well, it's a long time ago, and I knew that I had to address it, and this is what I say, because obviously it did have a big impact on me, particularly the circumstances of her death. And I'd had close friends who said to me, it's kind of, there's something in here, this kind of explains a little bit about how you were afterwards, and I never really knew or had thought deeply enough about whether that was true or not, or whether there was something in it. At the same time, I knew that loss is something which we all experience, and I wasn't the only person who'd gone through something. The circumstances were pretty confronting and difficult. So I just tried to really write it very naturally. Sometimes, as you're right, when I started to write about the politics, I would have a bit of a roadmap next to me, and I'd try and work through. I wanted it to be accessible to everybody. It wasn't a book for the insiders. So I wanted it to be accessible, but I wanted to get the bits down and in order. When I came to write about Mum and the fire, I just got up one morning and I just thought, I'm just going to go and whatever comes out onto the page is what we'll end up with.
So you didn't overthink it, and you didn't over-edit it?
I don't think you can something
told
like
it, right?
Yeah, I don't think you can something like that. And from my perspective, and this is what I partly end up saying, I think for anyone here, you've really got to, the loss hurts, but you've actually got to take what the life was, which is, I think, what people would want, you know, if they were ever able to channel back to you and say, well, look, hang on a minute, I know I'm gone, but actually, this is how I was, and this is what I left you, and this is how I was as a mum to you or a friend, and you can take that, and actually, it's sustenance for you.
And you say in the book that your mum is always with you, right? And that's...
It's the same for all of us, though, isn't it, mostly,
yes.
I think?
Yes, indeed. I'm interested in a lovely story that you tell about going to an aged people's home, it seems, where you watch a lady called Carla, is it? I think I'm...
That's right, yeah.
Sing Engelbert Humperdinck's Please Release Me to a group of aged people, and it really is one of the most loveliest parts of the book. Why, can you just tell us why you were prompted to write about that little experience? That really, because it seemed to me it captured a lot, it meant a lot to you. It was talking about music, the power of music and sharing, those sort of things.
It did, and well look, I was a musician in government, and one of the things in education that I discovered was that music's actually really good for kids. I mean, I sort of knew it instinctively. I think that being on stage and sweating it out every night, I mean, why is Keith Richards still alive, for heaven's sake, you know? I mean, it is. And you know, people who sing in choirs, and there's lots of evidence for this now, lots of medical research and studies and so on. And when I first went into a nursing home, I was so struck by the dismal nature of, and it wasn't a bad nursing home, but I just thought, wow, you know, and of course I knew about the baby boomers and the people are living longer, and I thought, there's going to be 10 times as many people in here in 10 years' time. And that was in the back of my mind as well. And this sense that just because you're at a certain age doesn't mean you stop feeling or thinking or being, and yet it was like a lot of people were embalmed in this place. And so when I had an opportunity to visit a new nursing home in the electorate, and they said, look, it's on a Friday and there's music and we have a party, and you'd love it, you know. The director said, bring the minister down, bring Peter down, you know, he'd love it. And I thought, oh, well, they might want me to sing a song or whatever. But eventually we got down there, and of course it was the most magic thing that happened, to see the people who were in the nursing home essentially released by...
Come to life, as it were, right?
Exactly, come to life. And it said to me that in terms of education and how we conduct ourselves and what we place a priority on as Australians, some of the things that were important to me, preserving the environment, cultural and creative life and singing, were actually important. It wasn't just that I had a personal view as Peter Garrett that they were important, they actually are really important. And I'm kind of in the groove on that with them. And I think that you can teach people to be literate. With computers and online access, you know, a lot of kids get very bored. I got bored by the time I was 15 or 16. I wasn't interested in science and maths and everything, and I was sort of pretty much all over geography and history. And like, what are we waiting for? And what you're waiting for is to be a well-developed, confident, resilient person, someone who can learn and adapt, who knows how to work with others, who can come up with ideas, who's got emotional intelligence as well. This stuff doesn't come from learning out of a book. It comes from expression, it comes from community, it comes from music and art and creativity, and it comes from being out when you're young and testing yourself in the natural world, which is non-judgmental, totally non-judgmental. When you're out in the natural world, it's you and you. You just happen to be climbing a mountain or swimming across a creek. And so it was really a moment that distilled for me the sort of things which I think are necessary priorities and things that I like to be involved in and things that I've done in the past.
Fantastic. Peter, we're about to ask some questions from the audience, take some questions. We've got people with microphones moving around, so now is your time to find out the hidden meaning in various lyrics and... what he really said to anybody. You'll be out. There's plenty of very interesting information in here anyway, but you might be able to glean some extra things. So please, just over here.
Hi. First of all, thank you for sharing your life story with us, even if it was just 40 minutes. You went from being a performer that operates in an environment where you can pretty much say anything you want and you're very passionate about it, and then you went into an environment where you got to watch everything you say and everything is a compromise. How did you deal with that? What kind of toll did it take on you, and how did you deal with that transformation?
Look, it's a very good question, but I don't accept one part of the question, which is the compromise part. If I look at the things that we did in government and that I was passionate about, the reason I went into the parliament in the first place, one of the big reasons was that I was so frustrated that we weren't doing anything about climate change. And I found the policies of the then Liberal government abhorrent, and I thought the Labor policies could do with a rev as well. And one part of the book that we haven't had a chance to discuss, and Shaun's asked a lot of penetrating questions, and we did run out of time, was the period of time I spent at the ACF, when effectively we had to try and negotiate really good results for environment where we could, with governments, plural, sometimes Labor, mainly Labor, sometimes Liberal. We had much more success with Labor, much more. And my values, the values of thinking about how you provide for greater opportunity for people, were keyed into what had been at the heart of the Labor mission of fairness for a long time, and I had strong connections with Labor. And if you look at the policies and you read the platform, there's much to agree with. So what you disagree with isn't a compromise, it's a recognition that everything isn't going to come in a perfect package in politics, and it wouldn't for other members who might be in the Liberal Party or in the Greens or anywhere else. And if you want to change those things, if you want to work those things through, you've got an opportunity to do that. It's just that you don't have an opportunity to do it in public anymore. Because, of course, as soon as you open your mouth and say you disagree, then it's broadcast to the world, and the party's in disarray and members are speaking out. That's not to say that I didn't find it difficult, but I accepted that I was joining a team and that I would be a team player. And I'd spent enough time as a student of politics to know that discipline was very important. I watched the Whitlam government pretty closely because I was a young student at the time, and I lived in Canberra. I started at ANU. And so I had all those hopes for us to do all these things, and before we knew it, they were gone. And one of the reasons that happened was because they didn't have the sufficient discipline to resolve their difficulties and their conflicts internally. Instead, it played out in public, and of course, the public lose faith, because the public are I've got to say this respectfully, but they want to bob each way here. They want to hear what everybody's thinking and what's going on, but as soon as they find out that people are disagreeing with one another, they lose confidence in them and they don't want to know about them anymore. And it's just simply the case with the incredible media scrutiny that you have, that if you're going to have really big arguments and stoushes about these things, you need to work some of that out as a team, and then accept the decision that is made as a cabinet minister. So I had to be disciplined. I accepted that discipline would be seen by people as being muzzled and people were leaning on me. No one leant on me when I was in the parliament, ever. I wasn't in a faction, and there were plenty of my colleagues that were saying all sorts of things to journalists, and including, I'm here with an eminent journalist, in confidence and so on and so forth. I just chose to do it a different way. And one reason is what I've just said, which is this is how I think governments remain stable and effective. But the second reason was that's not in my nature, and I wasn't in a faction to get involved in any of those things. So I accepted I was a team player, and I knew that I would lose skin as a result, and people's perception of what you do when you're in politics as opposed to the reality would mean that people thought that way, but I just had to accept that if I wanted to do the job.
Is there another question?
I think Shaun mentioned that you were critical of the Greens, and I was wondering if you could talk about that, please.
Well, I came into the Parliament and I had close relationships with a number of the Greens, and obviously Bob Brown would be one, and Bob and I had worked on issues in Tasmania for a number of years. And Bob had approached me about considering standing for the Greens. And I ultimately made the decision, which I felt was truest to my core beliefs and values and my background, to join the Labor Party. I don't regret it for 1 second. And I think that in the political attack, the Greens were very effective, particularly in the early period in characterising me as a sellout, especially when you have difficult decision-making around environment issues, including approvals issues. And yet, when I look back, even from the period of time when the Greens were effectively a minority partner in the government, I couldn't see, for the life of me, any significant environment achievements that they could point to. And I asked someone to volunteer one. I've got a lot of respect for Senator Hanson-Young because I think her advocacy in the asylum-seeking refugees debate has been consistent and it's been principled. But I didn't see much else there that said to me that the Greens as a minority party were actually delivering for the environment. And yet, whenever we delivered for the environment, even if it was only incremental, we were never going far enough, it was never good enough, and we were really failing. The other thing is that I think that both Bob and Christine Milne made an extremely political decision to effectively oppose the first carbon pollution reduction scheme. Had they not done that, history might have been different. And that was a classic example of the perfect is the enemy of the good. So many things would have flowed if they hadn't dug their heels in and frankly been holier than thou on that issue. We would be a lot further ahead than we are now. I didn't see in the Parliament much evidence of the environmental progressiveness of the Greens, and I worked very effectively with conservation organisations. The Queensland Conservation Council wrote me a letter at the end saying, we've never had a minister that's done so many things. I brought back the grants for conservation organisations. I knew these people well. I'd worked with them as ACF president. They weren't spending a lot of time criticising me. They might not have agreed with every decision I made, but of course the Greens did because it was the politics that was at play. And my final judgment is one about hypocrisy, because the Greens are always very strong on making a claim about everybody else's moral rectitude and pointing to the failings, either in policy terms or ideological or moral terms, of everybody else. But there's something going on when they effectively are spending all their time criticising the party on the left, which in this case might be the Labor Party, imperfect in many people's eyes, whilst at the same time trying to take votes off them because they need those votes from the left, whilst at the same time ultimately saying, well, actually, we think they're much better than people over here. They don't always do that, and I'm not trying to simplify it, and I'm not trying to attack Green Party members who would apply a judicious critique of both Labor and Liberal, but they ran a very good line doing that in Canberra, and I thought they got away with it at the time.
I told you the tone changed when he talks about party politics. See, another question here.
I'm fascinated and appalled by the adversarial nature of our politics in the country. And you just touched on it before with your appraisal of Senator Hanson-Young. I'm interested in which politicians on the other side of the floor and the crossbenchers you felt were really good people and that you worked really well with.
Look, I'll take the question, I'll answer it honestly. I don't really want to provide assessments of politicians that are currently in the Parliament, because I just think that this is a public broadcast and it's the sort of thing that can be taken by me to say, oh, Garrett says such and such is good, and by implication someone's bad. In the cabinets that I sat in, which included Jenny Macklin, Penny Wong, Wayne Swan, Greg Combay, Stephen Smith, Anthony Albanese and many others, I have great respect for those people. And I found that my cabinet colleagues, sitting in a federal cabinet, whether you're a Labor politician, a Liberal politician, or whether you're in a coalition, it's an incredibly privileged place to find yourself. They're smart, thoughtful, really competent people that you're in a room with, trying to figure out and work through policies and issues that you have in front of you. And that's where leadership becomes absolutely crucial, because if your leader, the Prime Minister, manages that group well and gets the best out of them, then I think you can get good government. I think that's maybe what Mr Turnbull's trying to do now. But I've got a lot of respect for the majority of my parliamentary colleagues. On the other side of the House at that time, when I look across, I can't see a lot of people who I would say I had respect for the ideological positions, but as people, I look at someone like Ken Wyatt, who's the Aboriginal member for, I can't think of the name of the seat, but it's in Western Australia, who I thought was somebody of integrity. If I look across the front bench, I wasn't overbowled by people in terms of where they sat ideologically, but I could work with somebody like Joe Hockey, for example, who's now exiting the parliament. And in the state sphere, I found that I could work equally well with politicians of all persuasions. And in the education reforms, interestingly enough, who were the education ministers who were responsible for agreeing that we would have this completely new education model for school funding? In Tasmania, it was Nick McKim, who was a Green. In New South Wales, it was Adrian Piccoli, who was a National Party. In South Australia, it was the current Premier, Jay Weatherill, who was a Labor member. In the Northern Territory, they changed course midstream, as they did in Queensland. And the ACT was a Labor member as well. And in Western Australia, it was a Liberal. Oh, she was an independent, really, but a Liberal independent. In other words, the whole mix. So this is the kind of politics I think Australians did want. And when we sat in a room, I don't think I'm misrepresenting it at all to say that I tried to deal with each of these ministers, who were state education ministers, on the merits of the issue. Whether they were Labor or Liberal actually didn't matter to me. We really just wanted to secure the agreement. So the combative nature of politics, particularly at the federal level, the fact that you've only got 2.5 years and you don't have fixed terms that run 3 or 4 years, means you're pretty much in combative mode quickly, means that you don't get to establish those relationships to really test whether you can work with people on the other side or not. But there would be others. Maurice Payne is somebody, Petro Georgiou before he left the parliament. And I can probably think of some others, but they'll come to me in a second.
We've got time for one more question.
G'day, Peter. I'm Andy. It's fantastic to have you here in Melbourne. Peter, I think I'm one of many people who are sort of hoping that the end of this phase of your parliamentary political career might end up with a reignition of your former career.
What career might that be?
I'm wondering how forlorn my hopes might be and how the other guys, Rob, etc., might feel about that.
So they want you to go to the ACF. Is that the idea? Let's go back to the ACF.
I didn't quite catch all of the wordings, but I think I got the spirit of the question. Well, you know, we came here and played. I think I might have mentioned it briefly. I think I mentioned it with in an interview earlier today. But we came and played after the terrible bushfires up at Kinglake. And it's quite a big part of my book, actually, that whole experience of Kinglake. And that was an event that had been put on by the Melbourne music industry, and Melburnians, as they do, came out in numbers. And it was a very moving, very powerful day. And the band, you know, it was almost like getting back on the bike. Whether we'll do it again in some shape or form is a question that everybody has to agree and deal with. And I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves, but we get on well. And despite the fact that Bones is in Nashville and the boys have got other projects, we're not saying no to it, but it has to be for the right reason in the right way, and it has to happen in its own good time. And one of the surprises for me was writing this book and then starting to feel the pull of music again anyway, and which I'm very grateful for. And so I'll probably do a little bit very low-key with some of the stuff that came out of this book at the same time. And I think for us, we know people would love to see us play, but we're also quite mindful of the fact that when you first go and see a band, whether it's Midnight Oil or Hunters and Collectors or Powderfinger or one of the newer artists, Sarah Blasco or whatever, you see them when you're young, you see them when all your senses are alive, and it's the most fantastic thing that can ever happen to you. You know, the first time you probably saw the birthday party, you went, whoa, you know, like what's happening here? And it's not like that now, you know, and it can't be in some ways. So you have to find another way of doing that and making it work for yourself on stage. And I think if you can do that as a band, then of course you can go out and play to people. But we've yet to have that discussion.
Cold Chisel, of course, are doing it, aren't they? I mean, they're Cold Chisel have, you know, kept going or broken up and come back, and
yeah, they had a big breakup, a big distance. I'm a big Chisel fan, you know. I think they're a really fine band. And I felt they deserved to do much better overseas than they did. And they're sounding as good as ever. Yeah, so of course it can happen.
It occurs to me, actually, that this is perhaps your first solo work, if you like.
In some ways, that's true.
I mean, I can't think of any other time where you haven't been working in with other people, right?
Shaun, I think that's a really astute observation.
Thank you very much. Is there any chance of you making music on your own?
I'm a collaborator by nature, Shaun, and I'm aware of my weaknesses and my deficiencies in skills. You know, I wouldn't consider myself to be a really strong, good songwriter, for example. I need to work with other people to get the best out of myself. So I think if I do something on the quiet, you know, that's low-key, I'll probably still work with others. But having been through what I've been through, which has been a tumble, sort of drier roller coaster ride that even for me has been pretty full on at times, I think it'll be nice to have the opportunity to get into the studio and see what comes out of it.
Well, I mean, this is really a sort of 4-album set anyway, you know, in terms of its weight and scope. So far, you've had a really big and interesting life. Congratulations on, and thank you for doing so many things on behalf of so many people in it, both entertaining them and trying to improve people's lives. There are many more decades of your life, so I look forward to seeing you writing the second instalment of this in another 30 years, and we'll both leave the aged care home together, and we can come here
and dance onto this stage.
Exactly. So please thank Peter for everything he shared with us tonight.